My name is Celeste Harmon, and I am 41 years old. 3 months ago, my father stood in his own living room and read us his will out loud before he was even dead. He said it was so there would be no surprises later. My sister Renata got the house. 4 bedrooms, original hardwood floors, a wraparound porch, a half-acre of land in the kind of neighborhood where the trees are older than most of the families on the street. Appraised at $2.1 million. I got the shed. Not a workshop. Not a studio. A shed. 12 by 16 feet of rotting lumber and a corrugated roof that whistled in the wind like it was trying to communicate something.
He actually smiled when he said it.
Said I was the practical one. Said I would figure it out. I wrote down the parcel number that same afternoon, drove to the county assessor's office the next morning, and requested every document on record for that shed and the land beneath it. What I found in that file did not just surprise me. It made my father's doctor tell him to sit down and breathe slowly when I read it aloud 6 weeks later. Before we get into it, if you are new here, please take a moment to subscribe and hit the like button. It costs you nothing, and it helps more than you know. And drop a comment right now telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. I love reading those. Now let me take you back to the beginning, because this story does not start with the will. It starts 22 years ago in a driveway in Claremont, Virginia, and a conversation I was never supposed to overhear. Claremont is a small city that has not quite decided what it wants to be when it grows up. Old money on one side of the railroad tracks, new construction on the other, and a historic district in the middle that the city council argues about twice a year without ever doing anything. My father, Gerald Harmon, had lived in the historic district his whole adult life. He bought the house on Sycamore Terrace in 1981, the year he married my mother, Eleanor, with a down payment borrowed from his own father and a 30-year mortgage he paid off in 22. Gerald worked as a civil engineer for the county for 34 years. Same office, same drafting table for the first decade before the computers came in, same thermos of black coffee, same drive home at 5:15 every evening. He was methodical. He was careful. He was, by any reasonable measure, an excellent engineer and a deeply inconsistent father. My mother Eleanor died when I was 14. Pancreatic cancer, very fast for months from diagnosis to the end. She was the one who balanced things out. She was the one who noticed when Gerald drifted toward Renata and away from me, and she would correct it quietly without making it a production. She would seat me next to him at dinner, or ask him to help me with a school project, or remind him in that soft, steady way she had that he had 2 daughters, not one. After she was gone, nobody corrected anything. The drift became a current, and then it became permanent. Renata is 3 years older than me. She is the kind of person who fills a room without trying, which is a generous way of saying she takes up a lot of space without noticing what she displaces. She was homecoming queen. She was her father's companion at every work dinner and neighborhood function after Mom died. She called him by his first name, Gerald, from the time she was 17, like they were colleagues or partners, and he loved it. He thought it meant she was mature. I thought it meant the boundary between parent and child had dissolved so completely that there was nobody left to be her father, just her admirer. But nobody asked what I thought. I was the quiet one. I was the one who got good grades without anyone putting them on the refrigerator. I was the one who made dinner 3 nights a week starting at age 15, because somebody had to. I was the one who applied to college almost entirely on my own, chose environmental engineering because I had watched my mother's illness take hold in a body that deserved better, and spent the years between 18 and 22 in a city 200 miles away learning how to read land surveys, drainage maps, and soil composition reports. I came home for holidays. I called every Sunday. I sent a birthday card without fail every year. I was not difficult. I was simply not Renata. The summer I turned 19, I drove home from college for a weekend to help Gerald clean out the garage. It was August, humid the way only Virginia gets in August, the kind of heat that makes the air feel used. I was unloading boxes near the driveway when I heard Gerald on the porch with his brother Ray, my uncle, who I had always liked because he was direct in a way most of the Harmon men were not. I was not eavesdropping. I was just close enough to hear. Ray's voice low, careful. Gerald, you know the property on Millbrook Road is still sitting there. Mama left it to both of you equal. You have to do something with it eventually. Gerald, shorter, quicker. I know that.
Ray.
You should think about who gets what before you're not around to decide. The house is one thing, but Millbrook is different. You know what's under that land. Gerald was quiet for long enough that I set down my box and stood still. Then he said, Renata's the one who stayed. Celeste left. I went to college, I thought. I did not say it out loud. Ray again, and I could hear something careful in how he chose his words. Gerald, Celeste is the engineer. She's the one who would know what to do with it.
You should think about that.
Gerald, I've thought about it. And that was the end of it. Ray said something I couldn't catch and went inside, and Gerald came around the corner and saw me standing there and looked at me for a moment without speaking and then picked up a box and carried it to the garage without saying a word. I did not know what was under Millbrook Road. I did not know there was a property on Millbrook Road. I filed it in the back of my mind the way you file things you cannot act on yet, under the tab labeled later, and I went back to college and finished my degree and built a life that had nothing to do with Claremont for the better part of 2 decades. I married a man named Theo Harmon, no relation, which confuses people more than it should. We met at a conference on groundwater remediation, which is exactly as romantic as it sounds. He is a geotechnical consultant, and he laughs at all my jokes, even the bad ones, especially the bad ones. We live in Richmond, an hour from Claremont, which is close enough that I can drive to Gerald's when I need to and far enough that I do not have to do it often. We have a daughter, Margot, who is 12 and already better at reading topographic maps than most of my graduate students at the university, where I teach 2 classes a semester. Gerald retired at 68. He is 73 now and in reasonably good health for a man who has eaten the same breakfast for 40 years, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, black coffee, and considers a walk to the mailbox adequate exercise. He is not sentimental. He is not warm in the way some fathers are warm. But he is not cruel, or, at least I had never thought of him that way. What he is, I understand now, is selectively blind. He has spent his entire adult life seeing what he chose to see and filing the rest under not my problem. Renata has been married twice. Her first husband, a man named Douglas who sold commercial real estate, left after 4 years in a way that was polite enough on the surface and apparently devastating underneath. Gerald paid for her therapy, which I did not begrudge. He paid for her apartment when she was in between places, which I also did not begrudge. He co-signed a car loan for her at 36, which I absolutely did not begrudge, because that is what parents do. What I did notice, quietly over years, is that the flow of support only ever ran in one direction. Not because I needed it. By my early 30s, I was earning a good salary. Theo's consulting work was steady. We owned our house outright by 40. I did not need Gerald's money. What I noticed was the texture of the thing, the assumption that Renata was someone to be taken care of, and I was someone who simply managed. The assumption was so old it had become invisible. It was just the weather in our family. You did not comment on the weather. You carried an umbrella and kept moving. Gerald called me on a Tuesday in November. Not a Sunday, a Tuesday, which was unusual enough that I picked up on the first ring. He said he wanted me to come to Claremont the following Saturday. He said he had some things to go over. I asked if he was all right, and he said he was fine, just some planning he wanted to do while he was clear-headed. I told Theo that night, and Theo looked up from his laptop and said, "This does not sound like nothing." I told him I was sure it was fine. It was not fine. I drove to Claremont on a gray Saturday morning in November. The kind of morning that cannot decide between fog and rain and settles for both. Gerald's house on Sycamore Terrace looked exactly the way it always did. The boxwoods needed trimming. The porch light had been out since July. I had mentioned it twice. The house itself is a 1920s craftsman for bedrooms, 2.5 baths, the kind of bones that do not lie. Original plaster ceilings, oak floors under the carpet Gerald put down in 1989, and I have been mentally ripping out for 20 years. The wraparound porch. A detached garage that was once a carriage house. Half an acre backing up to a small creek. The neighborhood has gentrified steadily around it for 30 years, which is a polite way of saying the houses around Gerald have been bought, gutted, and resold for amounts that would have seemed fictional in 1981. Renata was already there when I arrived. She was in the kitchen making coffee, like it was her kitchen, which I suppose in some sense it already was, though I did not know that yet. She hugged me and said it was so good to see me and asked about Margot, and I said Margot was great and asked how she was, and she said wonderful, and launched into a story about a pottery class she was taking that I listened to for 4 minutes before Gerald came in from his study and told us to sit down. We sat at the dining room table. Gerald sat at the head of it, which he always did, because Gerald Harmon has sat at the head of every table he has ever occupied. He had a folder in front of him, legal size, manila, with a rubber band around it. He took the rubber band off slowly, the way a man does when he wants you to understand that what is inside is significant, and he took out a document and set it on the table and folded his hands on top of it. "I want you both to know what I am planning before I am gone," he said. "I do not want fighting." I looked at the document. It was a will, or the summary of one. He had printed it out himself. I could tell from the font, Courier New, 12-point, the default setting on whatever word processor he used in 1997 and had never bothered to change. He looked at Renata first. "Renata, you are getting the house." She made a sound that was half surprised and half not surprised at all. He looked at me. "Celeste, you are getting the Millbrook property." I kept my face still. Millbrook. The name from the driveway 22 years ago. Ray's voice. "You know what's under that land." Gerald continued reading from his summary. "The Millbrook property includes a structure, currently a storage shed, that has been on the parcel since 1974. My mother left it to your Uncle Ray and me in equal shares when she passed. Ray sold me his half in 2003. I have maintained the taxes since then. It is yours outright when I go." He folded the paper back into the folder. I said, "What is the assessed value of the Millbrook property?" Gerald said, "Oh, it is not much. The shed is in rough shape. Land is maybe 80, 90,000. Not like the house." I said, "I see." Renata reached across the table and put her hand on mine. "Celeste, you know I would share." She said it the way people say things they have no intention of ever being tested on. Gerald said, "I thought it was fair." Renata stayed. She has always been here. I drove back to Richmond that afternoon, and I did not say much to Theo until after dinner, after Margot was in bed, after I had sat with it long enough to think clearly. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and told him everything. The will reading, the house, the shed, the Millbrook property, and the memory of Ray's voice in a driveway in August 22 years ago. Theo listened to all of it without interrupting, which is one of the things I love most about him. When I finished, he said one sentence. "What is under that land?" I said, "I do not know yet." He said, "Then we find out." Before I tell you what we found, I want to stop for a second, because if you have ever been the child who was handed the lesser thing and told to be grateful, if you have ever sat at a table and watched someone smile while they explained why you got less, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment. Tell me your version of the shed. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do it now, because this story is about to turn in a direction Gerald Harmon did not see coming. I am an environmental engineer. I have spent 20 years reading land. It is not a romantic profession, but it is a precise one, and what it has given me above everything else is the ability to look at a parcel number and pull up its entire history in the time it takes most people to park their car. The Monday after the will reading, I drove to the Alderton County Assessor's office in Claremont, and I requested every document on file for the Millbrook Road parcel. Tax records, deed history, survey maps, any recorded easements or encumbrances, any prior environmental assessments. The clerk, a young man who could not have been older than 23, looked at the list I handed him and said it might take a little while. I told him I would wait. I waited for 40 minutes in a plastic chair next to a water cooler that made a sound like it was thinking very hard about something. The young man came back with a manila envelope that was thicker than I expected and set it on the counter, and I thanked him and took it to my car and opened it in the parking lot with the engine running for heat. The first thing I pulled out was the deed history. The parcel at 4418 Millbrook Road had been in my grandmother's name, Estelle Harmon, from 1961 until her death in 1999. She acquired it from a man named Briggs, one name, no first name listed in the deed, which was either unusual clerical practice or something stranger. After my grandmother's death, the parcel passed to Gerald and Ray in equal shares, as Gerald had said. In 2003, Ray quitclaimed his half to Gerald for $1, which is the deed equivalent of a handshake and a nod. Gerald had been the sole owner since then. The tax records showed the parcel assessed at $84,000 as of the most recent year.
Gerald had not been wrong about that.
The survey map was the third document, and that is where I stopped reading everything else. I am going to describe this to you as clearly as I can because the geometry of it is what matters. The Millbrook Road parcel was 1.4 acres. That surprised me. Gerald had said the shed. He had not said 1.4 acres. The shed sat in the northeast corner of the parcel, 12 by 16 feet on a concrete pad, surrounded by a chain-link fence that had been there since at least 1974 based on the notation on the survey. The rest of the parcel, roughly 1.3 acres, was unimproved land that sloped gently toward a creek on the southern boundary. But the survey had a notation in the margin, handwritten, in a style that looked like it dated to the early 1980s. It said, "Refer to ENV 1977-0042 for prior subsurface assessment." I wrote the number on my hand with a pen from my cup holder. ENV 1977-0042 was not in the envelope. Environmental records that old would be with the county's Environmental Health Division, not the assessor. I drove there next. The Environmental Health Division was in a different building, a low cinder block structure that smelled like old carpet and industrial cleaner. The woman at the front desk was in her 50s, reading glasses on a beaded chain, the kind of person who has seen every variety of records request and is not impressed by any of them. I gave her the number.
She typed it in.
She looked at her screen for a moment and then looked at me over her glasses. "This one's going to take me a few days to pull," she said. "It's in the archive." I gave her my card. She said she would call. She called on Wednesday. I want to tell you that I drove back to Claremont that Wednesday afternoon in a state of professional calm, because I am a professional and I am generally calm. This would not be entirely accurate. What I felt driving down Route 29 toward Claremont with the heater going and the radio off was something closer to the feeling you get when a calculation you have run 3 times keeps coming out the same unexpected answer. Not excitement, exactly. More like the particular alertness that comes when the numbers are telling you something the people around you have not yet understood. The environmental health clerk had the file waiting for me at the front counter in a gray archival box with a label in faded type. ENV 1977-0042. Millbrook Road, Alderton County. Subsurface assessment. Prepared by Harmon Engineering Associates. I stood at the counter and read that last line twice. Harmon Engineering Associates was my grandfather's firm. My father's father, Arthur Harmon, had run a small civil and environmental engineering practice in Claremont from 1955 until his retirement in 1981. Gerald had worked their summers during college. Gerald had then gone to work for the county. Arthur had died in 1987, 12 years before my grandmother. Arthur Harmon had prepared the 1977 subsurface assessment on a parcel that his wife, Estelle, owned. I carried the box to a table in the corner of the room and opened it. The assessment was 47 pages, typed on what was clearly a typewriter, with handwritten notations in the margins in 2 different hands. The first hand was precise and architectural, small tight letters. My grandfather's hand, I suspected, though I had no way to confirm it. The second was looser, more hurried. Someone checking the work. I am not going to give you every page of a 1977 subsurface assessment in this video. What I'm going to tell you is what it found. The Millbrook Road parcel sat above what the assessment described as a significant natural gas accumulation at a depth of approximately 340 feet. The geology was consistent with the Devonian shale formation that runs through a substantial portion of central Virginia. The accumulation was described in the report as commercially viable pending extraction technology and market conditions. The assessment noted that surface rights and mineral rights on the parcel were unified, meaning whoever owned the land owned what was beneath it. The report was commissioned by Estelle Harmon and prepared by Arthur Harmon and filed with the county in 1977 and apparently never mentioned again to anyone named Celeste. I sat at that table for a long time. The fluorescent light above me flickered twice and held. The woman at the front desk was on the phone talking to someone about a form that had come in wrong. Outside the window, a car pulled in and out of the parking lot. Normal Wednesday afternoon in a county building. The ordinary world continuing to turn. In 1977, the technology to economically extract natural gas from shale formations at 340 feet did not widely exist.
By 2010, it did.
By 2024, the leasing market for mineral rights on parcels with documented gas accumulations in Virginia had become something that my father, the civil engineer, should have known about. He had the assessment in his family's records. He had trained as an engineer. He owned this parcel. Either he did not know about the 1977 report, or he did know, and he gave me this parcel while telling me it was worth $84,000. I drove home. I told Theo. He sat across the kitchen table from me, and I read him the relevant sections of the 1977 assessment, and he listened, and when I was done he said, "We need a mineral rights attorney and an independent land surveyor." Not in that order. Survey first. I called a land surveyor named Patricia Odom the next morning. She came highly recommended by two colleagues of mine and had been doing assessments in Central Virginia for 30 years. I described the parcel, gave her the address, and told her I needed a full boundary survey with particular attention to the subsurface documentation. She said she could have a crew out within 2 weeks and a full written report within 4. While I waited, I did the research I should have done years ago. I pulled mineral rights lease records for comparable parcels in Alderton County. I pulled recent transactions. I called a contact at a natural gas company whose regulatory filings I had reviewed professionally and asked, in general terms, what they would pay to lease mineral rights on a parcel with a documented 1977 accumulation report in a Devonian shale zone at 340 feet. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Celeste, are you asking me what I think you're asking me?" I said I was doing preliminary research on a personal matter. He said he would have someone from their acquisitions team call me. That person called the following Tuesday. The number they mentioned for a standard 60% royalty lease arrangement was not the kind of number you say out loud in a county building. I wrote it on a notepad and stared at it. Then I called Patricia Odom and asked if she could move the survey up. Patricia's crew was on the Millbrook Road parcel on a cold Thursday morning. I was there. I stood in a field full of frost-stiff grass and boots and a good coat and watched 3 people with surveying equipment do the work I had trained for but was too close to do objectively. The shed crouched in the northeast corner of the parcel looking exactly like what it was, a structure that had been failing for 20 years and was mildly insulted that anyone was paying attention to it now. The creek at the southern boundary ran clear and shallow. The land sloped gently. It was, underneath its ordinary appearance, not ordinary at all. Patricia called me 4 weeks later. Her report was 32 pages. The boundary survey confirmed the 1.4 acres. It confirmed the unified surface and mineral rights. And it included a section, requested by me, specifically assessing the current status of the documented 1977 subsurface finding in light of contemporary extraction technology and comparable lease arrangements in the surrounding region. The language was careful and professional and precise in the way that engineering language is precise, which is to say it said exactly what it meant with no room for misunderstanding. The parcel at 4418 Millbrook Road represented, in Patricia's professional assessment, a mineral rights asset with current lease market value estimated between $1.8 and $2.4 million, pending formal extraction feasibility study by a licensed operator. I sat with that report for 3 days before I called Gerald. I want to be honest with you about those 3 days, because the feelings I had were not simple. I was not purely triumphant. I am 41 years old, and the part of me that wanted my father's approval did not disappear just because the numbers told a different story. It just got quieter. There was something underneath the discovery that hurt in a way the numbers could not address, which was the possibility that my father had known that what he was giving me might be worth more than what he was giving Renata, and had said nothing, had let me sit at that dining room table and absorb the gentle condescension of being handed the shed, the lesser thing, the practical thing, with no indication that the ground beneath it was where the Real inheritance lived. Or he had not known. which meant he had given away something without understanding its value, which, given that he was a civil engineer who had trained under the man who commissioned the original assessment in 1977, suggested a failure of attention so profound it had its own kind of sting. I did not yet know which it was. I was about to find out. I called Gerald on a Sunday because I always call on Sundays, and I said I wanted to come and talk to him about the Millbrook property. I said I had had it surveyed. He said, "You had it surveyed?" Like that was the surprising part. I said yes, I had had it surveyed, and there were some things I wanted to discuss. He said he would put coffee on. I told Theo I wanted to go alone. He understood, the way he understands most things, which is quickly and without requiring explanation. I kissed him and Margot and drove to Claremont on a Tuesday morning because I could not wait until the weekend. Gerald was in the kitchen when I arrived. Coffee made, 2 cups on the table. He looked older in the November light than he had 3 months ago, or maybe I was just looking at him more carefully. He had his engineer's eyes, the same eyes I have, the ones that are always slightly calculating, slightly somewhere else, running a parallel assessment on whatever room they are in. He looked at the folder I set on the table, and then at me. "You had it surveyed," he said again.
I did.
I set the folder on the table between us, but did not open it yet. "Dad, before I show you this, I need to ask you something. Did you know about the 1977 environmental assessment on the Millbrook parcel?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father did that assessment." "I know. Did you read it?" Another pause. Longer. Gerald looked at his coffee cup. "I know there was an assessment. Your grandfather did a lot of them in that area. He thought there might be something under some of those parcels. He was right about a few of them, I think." Things moved slowly. "Did you read this specific one? The one on the Millbrook parcel?" Gerald looked up at me, and in his face I saw something I did not expect, which was not guilt exactly, and not defensiveness exactly, but something more like a man encountering a calculation he had deliberately avoided making finally laid out in front of him. He had known there was something. He had not wanted to know how much. "Your grandfather kept a lot of files," Gerald said. "After he died, your grandmother held everything. After she died, Ray and I sorted through things. There was a lot of paper." I opened the folder. I set Patricia's report on the table, and I set the original 1977 assessment beside it, and I set the comparable lease transaction records I had pulled for the surrounding county on top of those. Not to perform anything. Not for drama. Because I am an engineer, and this is how engineers communicate. With documentation. In sequence. I walked him through it the way I would walk a client through it. The 1977 finding.
The depth.
The formation type. The unified mineral rights. Patricia's current assessment of market value. Gerald read slowly. He read the way he always read, which is the way engineers read, going back to recheck things, following the footnotes, tapping the table lightly when something registered. When he got to Patricia's estimated lease value, his hand went flat and still on the table. He read that section twice. Then he set the report down and put both hands flat on the table and looked at the wall. 1.8 to 2.4 million, he said. Not a question. Just the numbers out loud in his own kitchen. The current market for mineral rights leases in this zone, yes, I said.
He was quiet for a long time.
Through the kitchen window, I could hear the neighbor's dog barking at something. The refrigerator hummed. Gerald breathed slowly, and I watched him understand what he had done, watch the full architecture of it assemble itself in real time in a man who had trained his whole career to read exactly this kind of data and had, in this one crucial instance, chosen not to. He had given Renata the house he knew the value of. He had given me the land he had not permitted himself to evaluate. He had told himself it was fair because he had told himself it was worth $80,000. And he had told himself that because looking at it more carefully would have required him to reckon with something he had been avoiding for decades. "Gerald," I said quietly, "did you know?" And he said, "Not the way you know. I suspected there might be something there. I thought the time had passed. I thought if it was ever going to be worth anything, your grandfather would have done something with it himself." He looked at me, and in his face, finally, something I had been waiting 41 years to see. Not performance. Not the selective blindness. Something real and uncomfortable and true. "I made a mistake," he said. Those 4 words in my father's kitchen on a Tuesday morning in November, I want to be honest, they did not fix everything. They do not fix 22 years of dinners where Renata sat at his right hand and I cleared the plates. They do not fix the will reading at that dining room table where he smiled and called me the practical one. They do not reverse the current that ran quietly through our family for decades, the assumptions so old it had become invisible. But they were the first honest thing he had said to me in a very long time. If you have ever waited for an admission you were not sure was coming, if you have ever sat in a kitchen and watched someone you love do the math they should have done years ago, drop a comment.
Tell me.
And if you have not subscribed yet, please do it now because I want to tell you what happened next, which is the part that involved a phone call to Renata that I did not make, and the part that Gerald made himself. Gerald called his estate attorney that same Tuesday afternoon. I know this because I was sitting in his living room when he made the call. He asked the attorney to come to the house the following day. He said there were adjustments he wanted to make. The attorney, a woman named Sandra Beach who had been handling Gerald's legal affairs for 15 years, arrived at 10 in the morning. She was brisk and organized and did not waste words. She sat across from Gerald with a yellow legal pad, and she looked at the documents I had assembled, and she read Patricia's report summary, and she said, "Gerald, this changes the calculus on the estate considerably." Gerald said, "I know that." She said, "If you want equity between the beneficiaries, you have options. You can restructure the bequests entirely. You can establish a trust that equalizes the values over time. Or you can proceed as written and let the mineral rights convey to Celeste as planned, which, given the current assessment, would result in a significantly unequal distribution in Celeste's favor." Gerald looked at that last option for a moment. Then he said, "That last one was an accident. I want to fix it." Sandra said, "What does that look like to you?" Gerald said, "Renata gets the house as I planned. Celeste gets the Millbrook parcel as I planned. But I want to establish a trust from my other liquid assets that brings the total value for each daughter to an equal number based on the current assessments. Whatever the house is worth and whatever Millbrook is worth, I want them equal when I am gone." Sandra wrote this down. She looked at me. "Is that agreeable to you, Celeste?" I said, "I want one other thing in writing." Both of them looked at me. "I want the estate documents to reflect that the Millbrook parcel contains a documented natural gas accumulation as assessed in 1977 and reassessed in 2024, and that this was the basis for the equalization trust. I want it on the record that the original bequest was based on an undervaluation and that this is the correction." Sandra looked at Gerald.
Gerald looked at me. "Why?" he said.
"Because someday Renata is going to want to understand how the numbers worked out. And I want her to have accurate documentation instead of a story." Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. The equalization trust was not the part that made Gerald's doctor tell him to breathe slowly. That came 6 weeks later. Gerald called Renata. I was not there for that call. I know what happened because Gerald told me afterward, and because Renata texted me 4 hours after it, a long message full of exclamation points and capital letters that I read twice and set face down on the kitchen counter. Gerald had explained the survey. He had explained the 1977 assessment. He had explained what was under the land on Millbrook Road and what it was currently worth. He had explained the equalization trust. What he apparently had not anticipated, though I do not know why, was that Renata would not hear equalization trust. What Renata heard was that she was getting the house and I was getting land worth somewhere between $1.8 and $2.4 million and a trust on top of it. She had been the one who stayed. She had been the one at his right hand for 20 years. And now the quiet sister, the one who left, the practical one, had had the land surveyed and the numbers had come out in my favor, and she felt that as a profound injustice. She called Gerald back. She called him twice. Gerald told me his blood pressure went up during the second call to a number his doctor considered concerning. His doctor told him to sit down and breathe slowly and to stop having high-stakes financial conversations on the telephone for the remainder of the week. I did not feel triumphant about that either. Gerald is 73, and his health matters to me regardless of what he did with his estate documents. What I felt was a very old tiredness, not anger. Something calmer and sadder than anger. The tiredness of watching a person who has spent her whole life in the warm center of her father's attention discover that the geometry of the thing was more complicated than she had known, and respond to that discovery not with curiosity, but with grievance. Renata texted me 4 hours after Gerald called her. The text was long. I will not reproduce it word for word, but I will tell you its structure, because the structure told me everything I needed to know. It began with how hurt she was. It moved to how unfair this was. It landed, eventually, on a question. Did I really need to have it surveyed? Did I really need to make this into a whole thing? I read that last sentence 3 times. Did I really need to have it surveyed? I was handed a shed and told it was worth $80,000. I am an environmental engineer. Having it surveyed was not a power move or a provocation or a whole thing. It was the thing any competent person does when they are handed a piece of land and told to figure it out. It was exactly the thing Gerald called me the practical one for. The practical one looked at the land and read what was in it, and the numbers came out the way they came out. That is not a thing I did to Renata. That is simply the thing that was true, underneath the surface, waiting for someone to check. I did not reply to Renata's text that day. I thought carefully about what I wanted to say, and I waited 48 hours, which is my personal policy for responding to messages that arrive when someone is upset, and I am likely to also be upset even if I am not showing it. Then I wrote back. Short, factual, no adjectives I did not need. Renata. I had the property surveyed because I am an engineer, and that is what engineers do with land. The results are documented and on the county record. Dad is handling the estate adjustments with Sandra. I hope you will find a way to be at peace with the outcome. If you want to talk once things have settled, I am here. She did not reply for 2 weeks. Gerald's estate documents were updated before Christmas. The Equalization Trust was established. The language I requested was in the filing, the documented natural gas accumulation, the 1977 assessment, the 2024 reassessment, the correction of the original undervaluation. It is on record. It will be there when the estate settles. I drove out to Millbrook Road one afternoon in January alone. The shed was still standing in the northeast corner of the parcel, which surprised me slightly. I had half expected it to have given up entirely in the intervening months. It had not. It was listing slightly to the east, and several boards along the south wall had separated in the way boards do when the foundation below them shifts. The corrugated roof was intact, barely. I stood inside it for a moment. It smelled like old wood and something metallic. The concrete pad was cracked along one edge, but otherwise solid. There was a shelf on the interior north wall with 3 coffee cans on it, the kind people keep hardware in. I did not look inside them. I stood in that 12 by 16 space and looked out through the gap in the door frame at 1.3 acres of frost-stiff Virginia land sloping toward a creek, and I thought about my grandmother Estelle, who bought this parcel in 1961 and kept it for 38 years, and about my grandfather Arthur, who knelt over a survey map in 1977 and wrote his findings in careful tight letters in the margins and filed the report with the county, and then, at some point between 1977 and his death in 1987, did not tell his son what he had found here, or told him and the telling did not hold, or told him in some incomplete way that lodged in Gerald's mind as might be something rather than a something, and Gerald had carried might be something for 40 years without ever letting himself verify it. I thought about my Uncle Ray in a driveway in August, 22 years ago. You know what's under that land? And Gerald's answer, flat, closing the conversation before it could develop.
I've thought about it. He had thought about it.
He had thought about it and chosen not to look. I locked the shed, which took some effort because the padlock had rusted and required a specific angle of approach that I had to figure out by trial and error, which felt appropriate. I walked the full perimeter of the parcel. It took 11 minutes at a normal pace. The creek at the southern boundary was running clear. There was a stand of black walnut trees along the western edge that I had not noticed on the survey day, mature trees, 30 years old at least, which meant Estelle had planted them or they had come up naturally in the years after she bought the land. Either way, they were beautiful, and they were mine. I thought about what it means to be handed something and told what it is worth by someone who has not done the work of actually finding out. I thought about how long I had accepted that valuation, not just of the parcel but of myself, because the two are not unrelated. The practical one. The one who will figure it out. The one who left, as if leaving for college and building a career and returning every Sunday for 20 years was a form of abandonment rather than a form of life. I thought about Patricia Odom's crew on a cold Thursday morning with their equipment in the frost-stiff grass, doing the precise, patient work of reading what is actually there rather than what someone assumed was there. The numbers do not lie. The formation at 340 feet is the same formation it was in 1977. It did not become more valuable because I found it. It was always what it was. I just looked. Here is what I have learned from this, for whatever it is worth. The people who hand you the lesser thing and call it fair are often the people who have not checked. They have made an assumption about your value and theirs, and they have arranged the world accordingly, and they have called the arrangement justice. Sometimes the assumption is malicious. More often it is the ordinary human tendency to not examine things too closely when the examination might be uncomfortable. Gerald is not a villain. He is a man who trained as an engineer and spent his entire professional career reading the ground beneath things with precision, and then came home and refused, in this one crucial matter, to apply those same skills to his own family, because applying them would have required him to see something he was not ready to see. I do not know if I have fully forgiven him. I am not sure forgiveness is the right category. What I know is that I went to the county assessor's office on a Monday morning, and I waited 40 minutes in a plastic chair, and I did the work. And the work told the truth. And the truth is now on record in Alderton County in two places, the Environmental Health Archive and the estate documents of Gerald Arthur Harmon, with a notation that says this is the correction of the original undervaluation. That notation matters to me. Not because it is revenge. It is not revenge. It is documentation. It is the difference between a story that gets told wrong by the people who benefited from the error and a record that simply states what happened. I have spent my career learning that the ground does not lie. The formation is where the formation is. The depth is what the depth is. You can choose not to look, but you cannot change what is there by choosing not to look. I am the practical one. I figured it out. Renata and I spoke for the first time in 6 weeks on a Sunday afternoon in February. She called, which surprised me. Her voice was quieter than usual, tired in a way I had not heard before. She said she had been thinking. She said she knew she had not handled things well. She said she did not understand why she had not known about the Millbrook parcel, that Gerald had never mentioned it to her either, that the whole thing had come at her sideways, and she had reacted from inside the shock rather than the facts. I said I understood that. I said the facts are now documented and available to both of us, and I am not interested in continuing this as a conflict. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did you always know there was something under that land?" I told her about the driveway. August, 22 years ago. Ray's voice. "What's under that land?" She said, "Gerald never told me about that conversation." I said I know. Another silence. Then she said, "You always paid attention to different things than I did." I said yes.
We did.
We always did. The shed is coming down this spring. I've spoken to an architect in Claremont about designing a small structure on the northeast corner of the parcel, something modest, functional, a place to work and to think, with good windows facing south toward the creek and the black walnuts. I have spoken to the natural gas company's acquisitions team 3 more times. The formal extraction feasibility study is scheduled for April. The lease arrangement, when it is finalized, will go into a trust for Margot's education and for whatever comes after that. The parcel at 4418 Millbrook Road is 1.4 acres of Virginia land with a creek on the southern boundary and black walnut trees along the western edge, and 340 feet below the surface, a formation my grandfather found in 1977 and wrote down carefully in tight small letters and filed with the county and trusted, I think, that someone would eventually look. I looked. Here is what I want to leave you with, because I know some of you are sitting with your own version of the shed. Your own lesser thing that someone handed you with a patient explanation of why it made sense. Your own parcel that nobody thought to evaluate because the assumption was made long before you were in a position to question it. Look at the ground. Not the story about the ground. Not the number someone wrote on a document 20 years ago, without checking. The actual ground, with the actual tools, done by someone with the training and the patience to read what is really there. You may be surprised what you find. That is my story. 22 years, one surveyor's report, and a shed that turned out to be the most valuable thing in the room. If this reminded you to look more closely at something you have been handed and told not to question, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.